Good afternoon, everyone. So the format of our talk is going to reflect the highly collaborative nature of this work. So I'm going to present the first part of the talk, and then Morgan is going to take over in the second part. Okay. Automatic recognition technologies that gather and analyze data from individuals in an attempt to automatically recognize complex characteristics such as sexuality, ethnicity, and even criminality are becoming more prevalent. Most of the existing research and development efforts in this space has really focused on the technical aspects of these systems. We believe that as these systems become more complex and prevalent, it's important to look into the social and ethical implications of their wide deployment. An example of such technology is automatic gender recognition, or AGR, which refers to a series of algorithmic methods, including automatic facial recognition and body recognition that extract features from images, video, and/or audio of individuals to identify their gender. Examples of AGR to date include marketing applications, human-robot interaction, and security and surveillance applications. An example scenario would be somebody approaching, let's say, a wall-mounted display and a video camera detecting their video or images and analyzing that and determining if they're male or female, and then presenting them with gendered advertising. Interestingly, in a lot of scenarios that is described in the literature, the individuals are not enabling the technology. The technology is enabled on them. Also, there isn't a lot of discussion around consent. To date, most of the research has focused on making these systems more accurate or more efficient, and there is generally a lack of discussion around the social implications of deploying them. Gender, of course, is a complex concept with important roles both as a cultural construct and a core aspect of an individual's identity. Research into gender is increasingly showing its multifaceted internal aspects, which exhibit much more fluidity and diversity than believed before. This complexity of gender motivates the current exploration. Okay, so we would like to define a few terms so we're on the same page. Transgender refers to an individual whose gender identity is different from the one they were assigned to at birth. Non-binary refers to an individual who does not identify as simply male or female, but may identify as neither, both, or somewhere in between. These are in contrast to cisgender or cis, which refers to individuals who do identify with the gender assigned to them at birth. For the remainder of the talk, we refer to both non-binary and transgender as trans, but we acknowledge the differences between these terms. Currently, about 1.4 million individuals in the United States identify as transgender. Recently, there's been more attention given to transgender interests and concerns in the media. Unfortunately, a lot of these stories reflect the challenges that this community feels in society or faces in society. The numbers are staggering. In the 2015 US Transgender Survey, 40–60% of the individuals reported that they experienced verbal harassment. 47% reported experiencing sexual assault, while 41% reported that they had attempted suicide in their lifetime. At the center of these experiences is the experience of misgendering. Misgendering another person's, so this refers to the experience of misidentifying another person's gender, either intentionally or unintentionally. While this might be a very unpleasant experience for anyone, it's specifically much more damaging for transgender individuals. It's reported that 56% of transgender people who were misgendered in the workplace attempted suicide. Research in HCI that focuses on the experience of transgender users is a small but growing literature. The works that exist are valuable and very important, but there is still a lot of questions that are unexplored. I won't go into the literature very much, but I would just mention that the existing literature focuses mostly on the experience of transgender individuals on social networks and online. In the current research, we were interested in studying the question of what are the perceptions and attitudes of transgender individuals about automatic gender recognition. Since we were interested in the quality of experience, we conducted semi-structured interviews with 13 participants, including 3 technologists. By technologists, we mean people who are professional software developers, for example. We conducted the interviews over the phone in order to account for the sensitivity of the data and to avoid inadvertently exposing our participants to the danger of being overheard, let's say, if the interviews were done in person in a public place. During the interviews, we asked our participants to reflect on existing scenarios, for example, the marketing example that I mentioned, and also imagine future ones, so the robot human interaction example. We strive for diversity, and we were able to achieve some degree of diversity. There were about 46% white or white-passing individuals in our population, and 54% of peoples of color. Additionally, 50% of our participants identified as non-binary, and 19% identified as male or trans-masculine, and 31% female or trans-feminine. Of course, these numbers just provides a rough overview of our population, and the gender identity of our participants was much more complex. Okay, with that, I hand it to Morgan to present the findings.
Thank you. So I'll just present 4 key findings from the paper, including supporting examples of participant data to contextualize them. So the first finding was that we found our participants were fearful that AGR could be used as a tool for surveillance against them. Fear that surveillance by automatic gender recognition will be used to persecute the trans community was perceived as very uncomfortable and invasive for them. P8 specifically in this example compared automatic gender recognition to histories of surveillance used against queer communities and communities of people of color. They also said that a lot has been illuminated in recent years about abuses of power and what can happen when people who have whatever bias are in control of certain surveillance technologies. These fears range from being kept out of public bathrooms to being physically brutalized by someone who they were outed to. Participants also described automatic gender recognition as undermining their autonomy. To clarify, we refer to autonomy as the ability for one to be their own person, make one's own decisions, and pursue a course of action in one's life without an external influence or force. Participants focused on the very non-consensual nature of automatic gender recognition, which they described as non-consensually capturing their images and non-consensually gendering them. P4 said, AGR is 1, completely unnecessary, and 2, undesired by many people who would be interacting with the software without their consent. Also, both P2 and T3 worried that their data might be sold to third parties without their knowledge or permission. The male and female binary that was often represented in automatic gender recognition literature reinforced a binary gender system that our participants felt exclude and invalidate non-binary identities and thus assure the misgendering of non-binary individuals who are interacting with that technology. T2 expressed a belief that this would give preference to transgender people who fit into a binary conception of gender or who pass as their gender identity. And participants expressed that technological futures should not simply replicate archaic gender systems which already exist. For example, P7 expressed that we're excluded from the direction of the future. That's sort of what it feels like. For P7, if technology represented the future, not including transgender people's perspectives, excluded trans people from that future. The concept of gender binarism, the lack of autonomy, and surveillance all presented threats to our participants' safety. And they felt that the concept of being misgendered by a machine would cause emotional stress. Participants were concerned that automatic gender recognition would perpetuate and amplify systems of oppression for trans people that they faced on an everyday basis. T1 said that it's easier for cis people to be like, oh, that's wrong, but it's more of a daily fight for a lot of trans folks. So I see that being harmful. It could be a safety issue, like the fear of being outed, and that could have job consequences or physical safety consequences. All of our participants raised concerns about the possibility of AGR being misused to perpetuate discriminatory or malicious acts targeting transgender individuals. From these findings, we present three major discussion points from our paper. One of the most prominent themes was that AGR technology embedded flawed binary representations of gender that caused harm. Participants expressed that gender is not something that could simply be read through physical attributes such as face, body, or voice by either human beings or technologies. And our findings show that for many participants, automatic misgendering could be perceived as more harmful than being misgendered by another human being. There is currently no apparent evidence that the internal and subjective aspects of gender identity are being discussed when designing automatic gender recognition algorithms. Another central concern of our participants was that automatic gender recognition technology would challenge participant autonomy and thus compromise their privacy. Specifically, participants were worried that technologies would be deployed and used on them without their consent or their knowledge. And these concerns often translated to a lack of trust and towards systems that aren't transparent about their functionality or the way that they gender users. Our results underline a need to support gender diversity when designing digital systems. Participants were concerned about automatic gender recognition technologies reinforcing these dominant gender binaries that they felt were already harmful. Participants' concerns also extended beyond simply other transgender individuals and included, for example, individuals of different races, cisgender individuals who present more androgynously, or individuals with unique facial features that aren't represented in the data that systems are trained on. Participants questioned why more input from transgender individuals hasn't been included in the design and development of systems that incorporate and interpret gender. Participants noted that their concerns wouldn't be mitigated by simply adding more categories, but rather by supporting user flexibility and autonomy. We present a series of recommendations based on our participants' input and on ways to incorporate gender in an inclusive and more sensitive manner. So one, inform users if and how they might be gendered and let them opt out. Designers should carefully consider the potentially harmful impact of incorporating gender into their designs, and they should consider avoiding developing it if it's unnecessary. If they do decide to include it, we recommend that systems explicitly inform users they are going to be gendered and provide them with the option to decline. 2, let users define their own gender identity. Rather than automatically assigning gender categories, we recommend that designers allow users to define their own gender. This choice should go beyond simply limited categories and allow users to define gender in their own terms to support aspects of gender identity such as gender transition and fluidity, as well as the changing language around describing gender identities. We also recommend that systems allow users to modify and update their gender information on a regular basis. And perhaps the most important point is to use inclusive and participatory methods that incorporate gender diversity when designing systems. We recommend including the perspectives of individuals with a variety of gender identities early in the design process. However, while inclusivity is important, it is also critical that it is not used at the expense of the autonomy and privacy of historically marginalized groups like transgender individuals. As technologies attempt to categorize complex human attributes like gender, it's important to address the perspectives of diverse populations who might be impacted by these technologies. In this study, we looked at the perceptions of trans individuals towards automatic gender recognition technology and found that our participants had overwhelmingly negative opinions about it. We then presented several recommendations for incorporating gender into technology design more inclusively. Thank you, and we'll take any questions.
All right, questions? We have time for several.
Hi. Hi, Margaret Burnett, Oregon State. Thank you so much for this wonderful paper. This is really awesome. Keep it up. I guess I wanted to also congratulate you on your recommendations. I love the idea of letting people opt out. This is a new way of thinking about opting out, and it has clear implications for privacy when we think about it. And the other thing I wanted to congratulate you about is the connection to product design and using gender diversity methods for product design. So all right, here I'm done with all the compliments. Now all I have is a pitch, which is there is a session on gender inclusiveness methods for product design, a panel tomorrow in the 4 o'clock session in room 520. Please come.
Thank you so much, and I would definitely love to come to that.
Hello. The participants in your study, did they give you any concrete examples of their own experiences with such systems?
You can go ahead and answer.
Yeah, so basically, because a lot of the applications that we described are future scenarios, the examples that our participants talked about were either thinking about the future, imagining a future and how they would feel, or stories that they had heard. So there are actually a few instances of automatic gender recognition technology being deployed in public spaces, and several of the participants had heard about this story, although they hadn't experienced it themselves firsthand, so they reflected on that scenario as well.
Sorry, to expound on that a little bit, I think one of the technologists had not interacted with it directly, but found that it was implemented in their lab, and another participant also compared it to how they felt that Snapchat had racial bias in their filters, so they kind of compared it to that experience as well.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great talk, and I'm Zhitong Lu from the University of Toronto. And so your talk reminds me of like some results from my research actually. Like actually in China there are some streamers who are like transgender, or like they may identify themselves as different gender as they like they were born. So I think, do you have any thoughts on like what your findings can be applied to maybe like YouTubers or like popular streamers, like maybe any design implications for like video websites about this community? Any thoughts on that?
Did you want to answer?
Sure. So thank you. That's a very interesting comment. And I think that actually kind of relates to maybe global community, because our study was focused in North America and like a big city specifically. I think one of the things that's known from previous research is that the transgender community actually uses technology in very creative ways to present and to connect to other members of the community. So looking at YouTube, for example, and especially the way that you were describing the performative aspects of it, I think would be really interesting in the future. We haven't looked at it specifically in this study, but to see what kind of practices or creative subversive practices, let's say, that members of this community use to express themselves or go beyond the categories within a system would be very interesting for the future.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Andrew at Kern, Texas A&M University. It's great to see this work and you dealing with these issues. There is, by the way, also a gender session in the very next round of talks in 516A and B. So I was just wondering, this implication of allowing opt-out or even for, insisting on opt-in, in terms of, so like I understand more or less what that means in social media systems, but then there's like, broader recognition, scraped content, live camera feeds, and so it seems to me like that implication has implications for how recognition in general should be allowed in society. Do you think that these things are separable or sort of inherently connected?
I would say that I would consider them very connected, specifically addressing that things shouldn't maybe be automatically assigned to other users, or I guess even in some ways they aren't users, but just individuals.
Yeah.
So I would say that it has broader implications as far as allowing people to opt into a gendering service, or at least a more contextual gender service in a way that they could define their own identity, where it's not, I'm just opting into being automatically gendered so much as I'm opting in to participate in a gendered experience. So some of our participants, for example, did feel that gender had a place in systems. So it wasn't that they necessarily wanted to eliminate gender from the system. It was more about that consent and autonomy. And I think that does span many different types of technologies.
Thank you. It's great to see this work again.
Hi, Ida from Old University again. This question made me think about, obviously you asked about gender. Did you ask them more in general, your participants, about how they feel about these kinds of recognition systems? For instance, ad monitors that recognize some feature of people to show them the right ads, because even if it's not specifically facial features, you could look at people's clothes and infer, oh, you want to see a Nike ad, but whatever that is, it could still imply something about gender that they might not be comfortable having shown, even if it doesn't say you're a man or a woman, it could still. Did you ask them about that in general?
You can go, because
Yeah, I think that the broadening of this question, like in general, automatic recognition in general, I think one of the things that is clear in this research is that our participants had really a big problem with lack of autonomy, because there are other systems that I work, for example, on speech recognition systems, especially in the accessibility space, and they can have a lot of amazing applications. The difference is that the person who's using this system is exercising their will to activate the system when they want to on their data. Whereas in a lot of the scenarios that are currently existing, especially in the automatic gender recognition area, the technology is enabled on the person. So that lack of autonomy is something that is a problem in a lot of automatic recognition technologies in general. But in this study, of course, we mostly focused on technologies that are specifically looking at gender. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Jed Brubaker, Colorado. Great work, guys. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what your participants thought about the benefits and trade-offs. They're doing this work for a particular reason, and that is either things they believe or that are believed for them or by their culture. How, as you were taking them through this situation, were they thinking about the benefits in relationship to the risks of using AGRs?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think initially when we asked, it was more of an open-ended, trying not to lead them down a negative or positive route, and they did focus a lot on what they thought were risks. But in the end, some participants also thought that there were benefits. Some people thought that it would be validating to their identity if a system recognized that identity. Others talked about the benefits this could provide to other users, such as people with visual impairments or people who are blind who want to know information about other people around them. I think it was more about the conception of gender as a binary, and also as we've said, the lack of autonomy in the way it's presented. But I think they saw benefits in applying gender to systems because gender was also a very integral part of their identity, and they didn't want that necessarily erased. But they felt that the way it's currently presented is too simplistic and removes agency.
Thank you.
And I'm going to take the last question as chair. So, Jessica Pater, Georgia Tech. This was really thought-provoking, great work. If I put my political scientist hat on, a lot of what you talked about is really difficult when you scale that and to like national and supranational levels, especially when thinking about things like security. And a lot of these systems are often developed and used under the guise of keeping us more secure. So could you talk about some of your thoughts about how maybe we need to be talking to different communities like the security community, and how we could maybe take some of these great design implications and incorporate them into those kind of systems?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, I think one of the points that became really clear through this study, and I hope that it is also clear in the paper, is that this is a complex scenario. I mean, there are a lot of trade-offs that happen, and the most important takeaway, we believe, is to work inclusively and in a participatory manner with people who are coming from diverse backgrounds and with diverse identities, and to include them in conversations around, let's say, security, privacy, and questions like that. And I think that in our study, we have these recommendations, but really the biggest one is let's use inclusive and participatory design approaches to find new ones, because this study is not really kind of trying to find a solution, let's say, but it's starting to open the conversation.